Welcome, everyone. This is Pat Bailey, Director of Training and Professional Development at Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. We'd like to welcome you to part one of our Building Bridges Toward LGBT Workplace Equality as we begin to explore the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender issues in the workplace. Joining me today is also Daniel Lawrence Smith. And so Daniel, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Hello, this is Daniel Lawrence Smith, Associate Director of Training here at Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. Thank you, Pat.
And again, I'm Pat Bailey, and I've been with Out and Equal for about 8 years, and this has been one of our key programs that we've used to advance LGBT workplace equality. What we're going to do today is go through terminology and concepts. This part one is a free broadcast webinar, so you should be hearing us over your computer or using your headsets. If you can't hear us at this point, you can go ahead and chat in, and we'll send you a phone number to call in on. But we'll go into part two and part three, which is the business case and talking about allies over the next 2 weeks on March 8th and 15th. Those are fee-for-service courses, so if you want to register that, we'll have the links a little bit later on with that. So let's get started with our lesson a little bit with a little bit of welcome and overview. We've done our introductions already. Logistics for today's webinar. Again, you'll be hearing us through your computer headset or speaker, or you need to call in. You can hear that as well. This session is recorded. We will send out after the session a link with the slides and the handouts. We will send out the recordings to those who have been registered for the full course so that you can follow that up. We will be doing some polls as well today. So when those polls come up, make sure you hit and select your answer and hit submit. We have about 41 people on the call right now. And so let's go ahead and get started. And Daniel, I'll turn it over to you on the first poll.
Thank you, Pat. So as mentioned, we ask for your active participation today. And our first question is, why are you taking Building Bridges today? And go ahead and feel free to select all that apply to you and your personal circumstances. So are you looking to gain LGBT cultural competency? Are you doing ally development? Are you a human resource, a diversity and inclusion specialist? Again, click all that apply and then go ahead and hit submit. Okay, we've got about 25% of people who have responded so far, so a lot of folks looking to gain LGBT cultural competency. That's about 70% of you, about 40% to review current information and trends. Again, about 40% who are looking for professional development opportunities. Great, we've got just about everybody and a lot of HR and diversity and inclusion folks. Wonderful, and ERG and BRG leadership. Wonderful, thank you. And I see some of you are logged in because this is a prerequisite course for our Train the Trainer to become an Out and Equal certified trainer. So thank you for joining us today. Talk a little bit about our program. Again, part one, we're going to be talking about core LGBT cultural competency. So we're going to go over key concepts for LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And we'll try to keep it to LGBT whenever possible so that this will be a 75-minute session and not a 3-hour session. We'll go over concepts and terminology. As Pat mentioned, we'll be presenting parts 2 and 3 on the 8th and the 15th of this month. In part 2, we'll talk about the impact of equality in the workplace and the business case, why it makes good business sense to be an inclusive environment, and how to bring LGBT equality to your organization. And then in part 3, we'll talk about the role of allies and then how you can apply these key principles to your organization. With our time together today, let's agree on some principles. Again, we ask for your active involvement. So please submit to the polls, use the chat box, send in questions. We'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. We ask for open communication, and then, of course, trust and confidentiality. So if something is shared in this space, not to broadcast it outward. We have another poll for you here. And our first question is learning more about who's on the call. And again, mark any of the following items that you identify with in terms of your personal dimensions of diversity. So we ask if you were born before 1975, if both of your parents worked when you were growing up, if you graduated college, consider yourself a person of color, if you are married, know somebody who is lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and if you know somebody who is transgender. Go ahead and hit submit with that. Wonderful. So as you hit submit, you'll see that different individuals are falling in different places within their own personal dimensions of diversity, some common ground, but also some differences. So very interesting to see with that there. And what we're seeing is about 97% of you say that you know somebody who is lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and about 70% know someone who is transgender. And what we also know from this is that about 60% of the United States population identify as having somebody who is lesbian, gay, or bisexual within their close immediate circles, meaning their friends, family, or perhaps a close colleague. So when we talk about creating an inclusive environment for our LGBT coworkers, we're also thinking about creating the inclusive environment for the mother, father, sister, brother of somebody who is LGBT. So thank you all for your participation there. We'll talk a little bit about the work of Out and Equal. So at Out and Equal, we believe that people should be valued for the work that they do and never by their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. And we're committed to ending workplace discrimination. And we go through this through our programs. We're probably best known for our Out and Equal Workplace Summit. We'll be hosting our 18th summit in Orlando, Florida, October 4th through 7th. We're joined by about 3,200 individuals from human resource, diversity, inclusion, employee resource group, and business resource groups. We also have our executive forum and momentum. We're very excited to be rolling out our global initiatives, creating Out and Equal workplaces not only in the United States but across the world. Our LGBT Career Link is our job posting board. And just last year, we partnered with our good friends at the Walt Disney Company to roll out the Out and Equal Equality Institute, bringing our message of diversity and inclusion to small and medium-sized businesses. And we're so fortunate to have a robust regional affiliate model with 22 volunteer-led regional affiliates across the country. Pat and I are the Out and Equal University, the training and professional development branch of Out and Equal. And we do our training through a variety of methods. Number one is in-person classroom trainings, webinars like the session that we are on today. We have a monthly town call series, which is a free resource for our constituents, talking about a variety of topics affecting LGBT employees in the workplace. We do professional consulting, and we also do speaking engagements. And for more information on that, you can visit us online at www.outandequal.org and look under University. I'll now kick it back over to Pat.
All right, thanks, Daniel. And what we want to do now is begin to talk about diversity in the workplace a little bit more and how it impacts us and how we shape our interactions in the workplace with each other. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do you bring that diversity in the workplace, myths and stereotypes, and then spend quite a bit of this session looking at the concepts. But let's talk about diversity in general. If you see the chart here, you can see there's an outer ring here that talks about maybe where we work. When we first meet somebody in the workplace, we're introduced by their job title, or we know their work location, if they're involved with a union, where their department is, their seniority, how long they've been there. That's the first level that we begin to meet people and begin to find out about them. Then as we begin to work together in a team, we learn a little bit more. A story that I share is that I retired from the military and then moved to New Mexico to work with a corporation there as a government contractor. And what I did not know that for me, my ethic in work is if you were 10 minutes early for a meeting, you were basically late. So I expected meetings to start on time. And the culture and the workplace climate in New Mexico was very much about meetings really didn't start until about 10 minutes or 15 minutes after. So that experience and the culture that we lived in, I had to adapt to. I could have continued to enforce that on time, but I could also understand that this was the way that people felt most comfortable, most productive, and begin to have those experiences. So we talk about things like our military experience, our education, our background, our communication style. Is it easier to send me an email or walk down to my office and have a conversation with me? Those are all the ways that we begin to build and work with a team, and each person is individual and unique with that. And then finally on this inner circle, you see things like age and race and ethnicity. And although you say, well, you know, I can tell someone's gender when they walk in, if they're male or female, or I can tell what race they are. But you may not see, if you see a person of color, you may not know if they're African American, they're Caribbean, they come from, South Africa. You don't know their background experiences in their lives, and that's usually not something that you share with someone in the workplace until you get to know them better. This would kind of be your inner circle of people that you work with. And if we were to do a poll through this, and we went through each one of these, we would find the kind of diversity we saw on that Dimensions of Diversity hand raise exercise, that we have a lot of different experiences, and some of ours may be similar, and that's the common ground that we found. But many of us have very different experiences that shape the way we react and respond. And so we have to remember that just in diversity in general as we go into the workplace to be able to talk about that. We also find that as new groups come into the workplace, if you can think about the workplace back in about the 1930s or so, it was predominantly white men that worked, in businesses and companies. There was other work that was available, but the advent of women and people of color came later, through legislation. But we also think about things that are said about new groups when they come to the workplace. We don't understand them. We don't know who they are. So I'm going to share with you a couple of quotes here that have come along over the years. And I'll give you a second to read that. And then I'm going to give you the source, that this was actually said about blacks in South Carolina, talking about African Americans getting married to each other. And this was back in 1865. It sounded very familiar, like what we had heard with Proposition 8 in California and the Supreme Court decision about LGBT. And another one. This was said by Joseph Goebbels in 1940 in Nazi Germany, talking about Jews. So again, we see that if you are not different, if you're not like me, sometimes the first response is fear, and comments like this come out in the discussions. And finally, the last one. This one always surprises me because it was said by Dr. William Pierce in 1997, talking about teaching racial equality in the schools. My belief is that there's a set of these and a book of these that gets passed on to each new group that comes into the workplace or becomes visible in the communities that we live. And once we find out about each other and we begin to work with each other and we begin to learn about each other, we find that a lot of these kind of rhetoric comments go away and are reduced. So it's important where we get started with that is being able to have the basic terminology and the concepts. So what we're going to start talking now is about those key concepts, and I'm going to turn it over to Daniel to talk about our first one about sexual orientation. Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you, Pat. So again, our key concepts, we're going to begin by talking about sexual orientation, who we are attracted to physically, emotionally, romantically. And then later on we'll go into gender identity, our internal sense of being male, female, or perhaps something else. But let's go ahead and begin here with another question. So we'll ask for your active participation. And we're just asking, do you have a sexual orientation? And again, go ahead and put your answer and hit submit. So yes, I think so, not sure, no, or prefer not to answer. Okay, good. And there's no stumping this crowd. About half of you have answered so far. And overwhelmingly, we're seeing that everyone's saying yes. And the reason we put that out there is because through modern media, we've been trained to associate sexual orientation with the lesbian, gay, and bisexual communities. But in fact, if you identify with any of these key concepts, heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, omnisexual, asexual, questioning, or queer, you in fact do have a sexual orientation. So everyone has a sexual orientation. So we're presenting it's not us versus them. Everyone in fact has a sexual orientation. And let's spend some time talking about that. So our very first is heterosexual or straight. And heterosexual or straight means that you have an attraction to somebody of the opposite gender. We then look at lesbian and gay. And that means attraction to someone of the same gender. Now talking about bisexuality, the way we used to look at bisexual would be attraction to both male and female. But we now want to broaden that definition. So we define bisexual as attraction regardless of gender, so that we're thinking outside of that male-female binary. Now how about asexual? This is one that we don't see as often. And we define asexual as lack of sexual attraction. Talk about some words that we want to avoid. Homosexual might be the clinical or medical way to refer to someone who is lesbian or gay, but it can be viewed as derogatory if you're labeling someone as homosexual, so we want to default to lesbian or gay. We don't want to say sexual preference, curable, or choice. It's not a preference to be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, just as it's not a preference to be heterosexual or straight. This comes up quite a bit, the term queer, and we're seeing this a lot more with the millennial generation. But within the workplace, we want to stick to lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. We'll show you some different images of communities, the heterosexual community. And the reason we show these is it's important to note that these images can cross socioeconomic backgrounds, age, location. Different images of the lesbian community. Images of gay men. And when we do this in a classroom in-person setting, I usually have a live example, which I can't show to you right now over the webinar, but if I did, I'd be striking a pose and showing you an image of myself. I am in fact a gay man, and the reason that I bring this up is because what I've just done to everyone on the call now is I've come out to you. I've acknowledged that I am in fact a gay man. And the reason coming out is so important is because it's a watershed moment in the lives of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. We first come out to ourselves, we come out to our friends and our family, and then we come out in the workplace to our colleagues, and we'll spend some more time talking about that. And some images of the bisexual community. Let's spend a moment and just talk about some myths and stereotypes associated with the bisexual community. Some of the myths and stereotypes could be that it's just a transitional phase on the way to being lesbian or being gay, that bisexuals are promiscuous, or that bisexuality doesn't exist, that bisexuals will never be happy with just one person, that women might say they're bisexual just because it's trendy. We think of the Katy Perry song, "I Kissed a Girl and I Liked It," or that men might say that they're bisexual just because they don't want to fully admit that they are gay. And some images of the asexual community. So now let's spend some time talking about assigned birth sex. So when a baby comes into the world, one of the very first questions we have is it a boy or a girl? So female and male. And this is fundamental. This goes on our birth certificate. It might help to determine what names our parents give us, what color they paint our room, what clothes we wear, what toys we play with. And it follows us. It goes on our passport. It goes on our driver's license. And this is fundamental. And a lot of this is determined by external anatomy when a baby is born. Now, also through the miracle of modern science, we can find out in advance through the use of sonograms. And again, this is something which is fundamental to who we are. It's a boy, it's a girl. Okay, but sometimes a child could be born, and based on external anatomy, it's not always as clear whether the child is in fact male or female. And the term we use for this is intersex. And many times this can have to do with secondary sex characteristics that can materialize later in life through hormones and chromosomes. Many individuals in fact learn that they are intersex when having reproductive issues. The term that we use to associate with the intersex community would be hermaphrodite. Again, a medical term, but not an acceptable term when referring to an individual. So the term is intersex. And of course we want to avoid saying abnormalities, maldeveloped, or mistakes of nature. These would obviously be terms to stay away from. Let's go ahead and do a quiz on where we're at so far. So our first question is to select the correct definition for assigned or birth sex. So go ahead and put in your answer there and hit submit. Okay, we're seeing the responses coming in. I've got about 25% of you who have answered so far. Okay, and about 84% of you, 85% of you, so this is doctor-determined sex at birth. Okay, so if a child is born male, female, or intersex. Great. And now how about the correct definition for bisexual? Okay. Got about half of you putting in your answers so far. Great. And the correct definition for bisexual is attraction regardless of gender. Again, we used to think about this as attraction to both male and female, but now we say regardless of gender so that we open up that gender binary. Some of our other definitions here, we talked about assigned birth sex, we talked about bisexual. If we were saying heterosexual or straight, that's attraction to someone of the opposite gender. Gay or lesbian, attraction to somebody of the same gender. And asexual, love, affection, or sexual attraction, rather lack of sexual attraction.
And Daniel, this is Pat. A couple of questions came in. There were, Judith made a comment about not being able to use queer in the workplace in terms of if employees or colleagues want to identify themselves as queer. That's definitely self-identification in the workplace is definitely for the employee. But what we've been finding is that within the workplace, allies and other employees and management have been using LGBT as the key way to work. What we see a problem happening is that if I come out to you and I identify as queer, then if you run down the hallway and say, hey, do you know that Pat's queer, that can have a very negative connotation to someone, especially within the boomer generation. We found that. So we've been able to suggest that. Our expectation is that as the millennials come into the workplace and in a few years as we get more comfortable with that word and self-identification, more people in the business community hear that, we will probably move to LGBTQ and then probably add A as allies as well. So we've got also a couple questions came in about pansexual as well. That was one of the terms that was used and created in the absence of the bisexual definition of either male or female, and it was kind of more of a regardless of gender. It was trying to expand that terminology and as a term. So it's really now because we've expanded bisexual to regardless of gender, many more people are not using pansexual. But it is, there's a long, long list that we'll send you out on the terminology of terms that people will use, and it's about the relationship. That's kind of the key point of what we're looking at here. I also wanted to make one more comment back on assigned and birth sex that we were talking about. There's 3 points where that kind of becomes apparent in a person's life. And the first is obviously at birth when the doctor looks at the baby, determines this will be a normal male, normal female. And about 1 in 1,000 babies are born that are not. The doctor can't determine that easily. And in the olden days, the doctor would say this baby is not going to grow up to be a normal-looking male, so we're going to do a quick surgery, and mom, here's your bouncing baby girl. Now the doctors obviously have conversations and it's elective surgeries, and many times they let the child develop and make decisions in their life later on. So that's the physical appearance that you see that is defined as intersex. Secondly, when a child goes into puberty, maybe identified at birth as a girl, but at puberty the hormones kick in and there's a higher level of testosterone. So may see bulking up of muscles, facial hair, premature balding and things like that begin to come in, and that's usually tested by the doctors to test hormone levels. And then finally, as Daniel mentioned, the third point is that if someone is having difficulty having a child, they may have genetic testing, and they may find out that genetically that they have an extra chromosome, and that's also identified under intersex. So again, it's not, these areas are not something that somebody may reveal to you in the workplace, but part of why we talk about assigned and birth sex is to begin to understand that there is a larger spectrum of diversity. We always think, boy, it's a boy, it's a girl. It determines what color your room is, and what toys you play with, what jobs you can get, if you can answer questions in math class, all those stereotypes that go with that. And there's a lot more to that. And let's see, Hugo asked a question about many of my lesbian friends find the term lesbian is offensive and identify themselves as gay and feel more comfortable with that. Yes, we've seen that too. And that's part of the nuance of this part of diversity, is that how I self-identify is the words I feel comfortable with. But again, we want to talk about that if you say, well, I prefer not to be called lesbian, I prefer gay, we know we're talking about sexual orientation. Any other comments on that, Daniel, that you've got?
No, it looks good. Thanks, Pat.
All right, great. And again, continue to chat in your questions and comments, and that's one of the disadvantages of having broadcasts is we can't unmute you and have you raise your hand, but we can have you chat in your comments and share with us your thoughts and ideas. And again, this is a collective. We know as adult learners that you have lots of experiences, and gaining that information is helpful, so please continue to chat in. We've been talking about sexual orientation probably since about the mid-1990s. We saw businesses began to provide benefits for domestic partners, provide protections in their EEO policy on sexual orientation. And when we looked at the poll in the beginning, almost all of us know someone who is LGB. We saw that only about 70% of this audience knew someone who was transgender. And gender identity has only been talked about now since about 2008. And more people are learning about it. Obviously, we see, we heard Janet Mock in the beginning, and we see a lot of media that's talking about gender identity. But people don't understand that we all have a gender identity, and that's the other part of these concepts that we're talking about. Just as we talked about sexual orientation, we each have a gender identity. I identify, I feel like and this is how I feel inside. Nothing that I do to my body at this point, but how I identify myself. And the terms that we see in gender identity is man, woman, transgender, could be bigender, agender, gender fluid. So let's talk about each one of these. And let's start with, if I'm born as a woman, and as I grow up, I look inside myself and I feel like a woman. I look in the mirror. I like the way my body looks and I feel like a woman. That's called cisgender, C-I-S. And it's a math term if you think about it in shapes and geometry. When angles are on the same side of a triangle or a triangle of an object, they're called cis angles. And so my assigned and birth sex matches with how I feel inside. But what if I was born as a man? And I feel like when I look in the mirror and I look at myself inside, I feel like a woman. And so that's transgender that we're going. So that's as a woman. Same thing for a man. I'm born a man and I feel like a male inside, cisgender. But if I'm born a woman and I feel like a man inside, the term transgender is used. And we'll talk about transgender and kind of the other aspects of these terms. But we also see the term bigender or gender fluid. This is an interesting concept because it's not new. First Nation tribes in the United States would have two-spirited individuals who were, and still do, who are the holy people in the tribe. They were, for ceremonies, they would be the counselors if men and women had a fight, and they would go to the two-spirited person, and this person embodied both male and female and was able to translate and go back and forth on that. It's evolved in culture now as therapy, but it is an important part to be able to understand that you embody both. You don't feel preference for one or the other, and that would be bigender and gender fluid. Now, traditionally what we've seen over the years is that someone says, I'm transgender, we're expecting them to go through a transition and to change their body, and when they get to the other end of the spectrum, male to female or female to male, they've transitioned and they continue their life in that space. But we're seeing more and more both in the millennials and in individuals who identify as bigender or gender fluid coming up as well. And then we see agender. We have, again, a lot that we're seeing in the millennial generation. HR is finding that I don't want to tell you my gender, I don't want to tell you my race, I don't want to tell you any of those kind of demographic aspects about myself because you may perceive that there's a list of stereotypes and myths that come up with that, and I'd rather get you to know me, so I don't identify with any of those labels. So some individuals say, I don't want to identify with either of those. Just as we've done before, we have some terms that we want to avoid. Sex change or reassignment has now been changed to gender confirmation surgery. We're not changing the sex, we're just conforming to your gender identity. Gender identity disorder is still included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but much like sexual orientation was much early in the 1980s, it's taken out as that you're automatically have a mental disorder because your sexual orientation is lesbian, gay, or bisexual. If you're uncomfortable with your gender identity, you can definitely have therapy treatment and there's a diagnosis in there, but you are not automatically diagnosed as mentally ill for having gender identities, variations, and diversity. Transvestite or tranny is usually not used and is that. And drag queen, drag king. You should never go up and ask someone, are they pre-op or post-op? Are those real? Those are some of the terms those are HIPAA violations in the workplace. It's a privacy issue, and is also very invasive in those kind of questions and doesn't respect the person's privacy and their process as they go through a medical process. We also don't use terms like transgenders or transgendered. So for example, we don't say straights do this, or I've been heterosexualized and things, those kind of terms. Transgender is the basic term. So I want to stop for a second. It looks like there's a couple of questions that came in, Daniel. Do you want to, before we get into the quiz?
Sure. Yeah, Nancy is asking if we could repeat the preferred term for the first item on the list, which would be sex change or sex reassignment surgery. So we now say that is gender conformity surgery. So we're not changing or reassigning our gender. We are in fact conforming to the gender that we've always been inside and identified with. So thank you for that. And then John is asking the question with regard to cross-dressing and cross-dresser and how that might look differently within the global conversation.
Right, good question with that. Now, someone who cross-dresses, when they look inside themselves, normally if it's a man and they feel like dressing like a woman, that's kind of where that drag queen, drag king came in. But it is more about, it doesn't change their identity. It's not how they feel inside themselves. That's more about gender expression and how they want to look. And for many people, there's concerns about, how does that work? Is that something that is more about, an erotic interest or those kind of aspects? Again, not appropriate in the workplace. So we have to make sure that, people are not using cross-dresser as well with that. And Joan, good comment. So a list of the appropriate and current terminology. We do have that when we send out the terminology sheet, so we'll get that in there. And Dinan asked about regarding two-spirited individuals. Again, two-spirited individuals in First Nations tribes embodied both male and female. They didn't have one or the other. And we're seeing that many individuals now who are identifying as transgender, in fact, are bigender or gender fluid. They feel like both. So if you think about that, spectrum of from one end male, woman, one end man, that they're in the middle and cross back and forth. They don't want to select one or the other. So let me ask a question now of you, since we've had some good discussions about that. Our next quiz is based on talking about gender identity. How do you identify? And if you want to select your answer and hit submit. And again, we know that our lists are not always totally encompassing of all the possible terms. So make sure if the term that reflects who you are and your gender identity is not there, go ahead and chat that in, because it's how we learn and we grow and we add additional concepts and terminology in there. That's great. So we're up to about 60 people on the call now. I've got about 45 responses in. It looks like 42% identify as male cisgender, 53% female cisgender, 2.1% female to male, 2.1% male to female. Caitlyn Jenner, question came in, identifies as a transgender woman. So male to female is her transition process. All right, great. So we look like we've got just about everybody there, and the numbers haven't changed too much on that. But again, for many of you, this may be the first time you've really thought about who you are and how you identify and looking inside yourself. Just like we do with sexual orientation, there's that piece where everyone around us is heterosexual or straight. And again, straight is one of those terms that is not a put down. It is the shorthand term instead of using heterosexual, just like we use lesbian and gay for homosexual. Straight is a term the community uses, so it's not a put down, but it does talk about heterosexual. But we've never thought about anybody around us who might be more diverse in their relationships. It's the same thing around gender identity. Most of the people that we know and that we've grown up with have that sense of, I match what the doctor said I am inside, so I'm cisgender. But there may be others who don't know that. For example, you may, on sexual orientation, have been in the closet and you haven't had a chance to really come out and say who you are because there's no models for you. Same thing around gender identity, and that's why it's so important. Again, the number one thing we find in the workplace is when you come out and you can be yourself, people get to know you, get to know all about you, not just about your sexual orientation and gender identity, but overcome a lot of those stereotypes. So again, here's some of our pictures that we have for those who are transgender. And again, the reason we show the pictures also is if you were walking down the street, would you look at these people and would you say they're transgender? You know, it's not the first thing that usually comes to your mind. There's many people that we hear the comments about, oh, I know, I can spot anybody who's LGBT. I know it right away. And in fact, many times you cannot. And if you do make that assumption, you can end up having problems because if you have a list of myths and stereotypes that come up with that list of if I identify you as gay or as transgender, then you're going to end up making mistakes about who they are. For me, for example, I am very stereotypically a lesbian. I dress more masculine. I ride motorcycles. I was in the military. A lot of the stereotypes that come up with that. But rather than making that assumption, if I come out to you and say I'm a lesbian, your first question to me might not be, do you ride a motorcycle around that. It might be just a conversation that we have of what kind of bike do you ride, and having a conversation about more than my sexual orientation. And same thing with gender identity. So we've talked about gender identity in general, and I want to focus a little bit more on transgender because we've spent a lot of information and training and background around this in terms of companies trying to understand this. And right now it is the umbrella term that we use for anyone whose self-image or gender is different from their assigned and birth sex, which was based on their physiological anatomy. And so that's why we see male to female, female to male, bigender, gender fluid, agender, all kind of fall under that transgender umbrella term that is not cisgender. So that's where we see those terms. And we see Caitlyn Jenner here in terms of has had a lot of exposure to that, and a lot of people have watched that process. But realize that Caitlyn Jenner's process is one person's process. And each transition, if you're going to physically make a change in your body, is different. But being able to identify as transgender doesn't mean you have to make that change. So let's take a look at the criteria. The World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH, has a standard of care, and this is version 7. And these are just some highlights of that. Transsexual is a term that has been used, and it talks about people who want to permanently change their body or want to change their body through medical intervention. Now, many in the community, transgender community, don't like the term transsexual. So again, just like we said that there are lesbians who don't like lesbian and want to be called gay, this is an area that you have to check with someone and kind of have that discussion. But you're not conforming to the traditional gender role and expression, cultural norms, and how you walk in the world or how you would like to feel in the world. And that can cause that gender dysphoria, that discomfort or that stress with that discrepancy. And there is a formal diagnosis that's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And someone who decides they want to go through a transition process may have psychotherapy, may look at changing their roles, dressing, their look and their facial and their voice changes. And there's a medical treatment process that is in WPATH. So it's a medical process of feminization or masculinization that is done through hormones and therapy and surgery. And so there is a medical path forward. But again, for many individuals, we had a former employee here whose only accommodation that they asked for because they were gender fluid was they preferred male pronouns. They were born female, but they felt gender fluid inside of themselves and were more comfortable hearing male pronouns. So again, thinking about your own reactions, and so much of this about diversity is about our own reactions and how we respond. Someone is coming toward me, looks very female, but prefers to use the pronoun he. Now, we make choices at this point about how we respond to that. I can't do that. That person looks like she, and that's the pronouns I'm going to use. But in fact, if we're paying attention to people and we're supportive of where they are, it's an accommodation that we make for individuals. And so that know that each person who's transitioning is an individualized path. More and more companies now are providing health insurance coverage for this in their policies, and we're seeing this primarily in the U.S. In a global discussion, a lot of this is covered under gender. Gender identity is a separate area outside the U.S. And you have to be very careful with your policies when you're looking at your insurance, because there have been some companies that have written it so that if you are transgender, if you break your leg, you cannot get medical coverage because you identify as transgender. Most of those exclusions we've now identified. We've provided guidance for companies, but check your policies, because as the laws have changed and more visibility has happened around gender identity, we're seeing more people are coming into employers in not just Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, but in mid-sized and small businesses saying, I'm going to transition, and how do we do that? And so employers have to take that initiative to make sure their plans are there. And for the top-rated companies, they're actually including and making sure that the benefits, the health benefits to get therapy and to get hormones and surgeries and all those are covered. So there's a lot of information here, especially if you're involved in the Corporate Equality Index, that your company should take a look at and make sure they include this as well. But think about when you're changing your gender identity, what you'd have to do. If I actually want to change my body and I was born a female and I want to become a male, I'm going to have to change my birth certificate, my legal name, driver's license, Social Security card, and all these other aspects of my life. I have a friend of mine who transitioned later in life, was born as a woman, went to a women's college, and so all the education records were based on being in a women's college, that now when he sends out his resume to a company, it becomes a discussion right away about, is this person lying in their resume? Why would they say they went to a women's college if they're a man? Or he has to come out as transgender in the first few lines of his resume, which could impact his possibility of getting a job. Now, again, as he's gotten older, the education records are a little bit, further in the background. But it's still a consideration of when he looks for a job that he makes sure that they have policies that support transgender employees. And so just think about all of those changes that you would make. Another key discussion is about pronouns, and I mentioned that already a little bit. And when we think about a pronoun, it's how we describe somebody when we're talking about that. I just had a conversation with her. And so we would use the term she, her, hers as pronouns for a cisgender woman, so a woman who was born as a woman and feels like a woman inside, or for a transgender woman, born male but feels like a woman inside. So she would be the primary one with that. Using the pronouns he, him, or his, a cisgendered man, a transgender man, female to male, so I'm born a woman, I feel like a man inside. And again, talking with people and their pronouns, these are very important. And then for bigender, this has been an interesting change, and I know if there's English or editing experts out there, the use of they in a singular has now been accepted by Webster's as one of the key changes in language that happened last year. So for someone that embodies both male and female as bigender or gender fluid, they is appropriate. So they were saying that they needed this report by tomorrow is acceptable with that. And I know for the English folks that that's a tough one to do, but it's how our language evolves. There's also another list of terminologies like Z, Z, and there's a lot of other terminologies that you can use with pronouns that take out the male and female dynamic of that. But these basically are the ways to start with that. And you can listen to people as they talk about themselves or as they're meeting other people or how allies are talking about them, that they can begin to change this. We also talk about changing names. If I go from Pat to John in changing my names, and I've had individuals that we've talked with who said, look, I've known you as Pat for years, and I just can't make this change. I'm going to continue to call you Pat even though your new name is John. In the workplace, that's inappropriate, and that isn't supporting the individual in their transition. Also, what happens is if you think about, well, it's just really hard to do and I can't do that. If a woman in your company gets married and changes her last name, when she comes back to work, there may be a few stumbles and you may get her last name wrong, but pretty clearly she's going to tell you that this is my name and this is how you should refer to me. And we know how to do that. And this is the same thing around transgender and name changes and pronouns, that we can all do that. So now I want to ask kind of a $1 million question, now that we've kind of given all that. Out and Equal provides us with $1 million, and we can use it in these courses. But the question is that if you do not identify as transgender, would you take $1 million to change your physical body to the opposite gender? And your choices are yes, I don't know, no, prefer not to answer, or not applicable. So again, think about that. If you were offered $1 million to go through therapy, hormones, surgeries, so that your body, which may be female now, will look male at the end, would you do that? And would you take that $1 million? I'll give you just a little bit here. We're up to 60 on the call, and we've got about half of you have responded so far. And again, if you think about this, I might have one who took that. We'll have to talk about that one. But we see that the majority of you, 84%, say no. And that's you looking at yourself inside, saying, I know how I feel inside, and if I looked different on the opposite gender, I might not be comfortable. The I don't know is a good, honest answer to take a look at that. And I've had people who've asked me, said, well, if I get $1 million to change, can I get another $1 million to change back? And again, we look at this as our first time, if we're cisgender, looking at our gender identity. But now imagine if it was someone who was transgender, and I would say to them, I will give you $1 million so that you can change your physical body to match your gender identity. That opportunity for many, many people would be an amazing opportunity. It's why we talk about companies having insurance and doing all of that. Daniel, I think I'm going to pause for a second here and jump in with any questions. What have we got with those? There we go.
Yeah, we have a comment from Mark saying that Tennessee never allows the birth certificate to be changed. And I think part of that is just looking at the regional landscape and how different laws and policies can change from state to state, and then certainly from country to country.
Definitely. And one of the things that has changed in the United States that's of the advantage is now if you're under a doctor's care for any stage or level of transition, you can get a letter from your doctor. You can go to the State Department and get a passport that does change your gender marker. And what happens is that helps with in many cases, the driver's license. Doesn't help the birth certificate because I know that there's still states that don't allow that. But if I change my passport and I now identify as male, and my passport says I'm male, I can use that male piece of ID to go and get my driver's license changed. So that's helped that some, and we're still working. There's a lot of legislation and work being done about trying to change as a national standard that you can change the marker on your birth certificate. Because again, when you get to security areas and things like that, you have to have those issues. That's it? All right.
Yeah, please feel free to keep chatting in your questions, and we'll try to answer them as we're going along or devote some time at the end for those. I'll just take a moment to touch on Pat's $1 million question. And as we saw, an overwhelming majority of the individuals on the call said that no, that for $1 million you felt that personal about your gender identity that you were not willing to go through the process of transitioning. Again, leaving surgery and hormones alone, even if we're just talking about the legal documentation, going through that process, and then coming out at work and to your family and friends. Let's then flip it around and pretend that the $1 million are off the table. Okay, no one's offering you $1 million to change your gender identity. But you identify as a different gender than how you were born, and you feel that strongly about your gender identity that you're willing to go through the process without the $1 million on the table. And much of this expense is going to be incurred at your own expense. So just looking at it from the other side of the table as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel. I want to talk a little bit about laws. Up until a couple of years ago, there was no law that required anyone to support LGBT employees in the workplace. There is, we'll talk about in the business case about the legal structure. But essentially what happened about 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, a case was brought up with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It was called the Mia Macy case. And she basically had applied for the job prior to transition, so as a male, applied for the job, was qualified, was offered the job. Through the long process of government hiring, had begun the transition and notified alcohol, tobacco, and firearms that she was in fact now transitioning, and here was a new name and the new gender marker and all of that. ATF withdrew the offer and did not hire her and ended up hiring someone else. And she went to the ATF Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, within the ATF, and said, I think I've been discriminated against. I'd like to file a case. And they said, well, you know, we'll put it in, but it's just about gender identity, not about gender. So they did file the case, and it did go up to EEOC, and it was found that, in fact, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is about gender discrimination, it was in fact a violation because as a man they thought that she could do the job, and then when she transitioned to a woman they basically said she could not. So gender identity was protected. And they've also now included sexual orientation. So although there's not legal protection in the country, in the U.S. at this point, there are protections that do say that you can have a case brought to the federal EEOC, and EEOC has the right to fine against your company. They levy fines, and there's usually a pretty good batch of publicity that goes along with that. So now there is a legal risk, and there's risk mitigation that you have to think about if you're going to discriminate against your employees based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And beyond just the health access and the opportunity to do that, employers basically have to make sure that they protect their employees from any physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or disruptive behavior. Now, as a minimum, your employee will quit and leave, and you'll lose that valuable resource. But beyond that, you are subject and liable to legal recourse at this point because of the Title VII with that. So just thinking about that as we talk about next week in the business case, how that impacts you. And we do see that transgender employees face quite a bit of discrimination. This was a report that was done a few years back on the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, and it shows that double the rate of unemployment, especially for people of color, is up to 4 times the national unemployment rate for transgender employees. And about 90% of them have reported experiencing harassment, mistreatment, discrimination on the job. That's resulted in 47% for being fired, being denied or not hired, denied a promotion, or being moved from their job. Imagine someone's transitioning and they're outward facing with your customer, and the boss basically says, wow, you know, with this transition you really don't look enough like a woman, so we're going to move you to filing until you complete this process, kind of thing. That's an adverse impact, and is based on how a person looks and their gender identity, and again now can be taken up to EEOC. And again, 26% have lost a job because of that. 78% who have transitioned say when they get through that process, they feel much more comfortable at work, more productive, and they're improved despite these high levels of mistreatment. So it comes back, there is more and more data that's being found that says that if people can be themselves in the workplace and they're comfortable with that, it doesn't become the issue that they're dealing with every day or dealing with comments from coworkers or feeling like they can't be themselves. They can get back to doing their job and can help with the business. Now, we've created some workplace guidelines that we definitely suggest. The link is down here on the bottom so that you can take a look at this. We have a transgender advisory committee that it represents many companies that work together. We also have Jameson Green on our advisory committee, who is the current president of the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH. And they went through in great depth the details of what it takes to create a transition plan. Because what happens and what we're seeing in many companies is that somebody walks in and says, I want to transition in the workplace. Usually the last place that they transition because they don't want to lose their jobs. They're concerned about those kind of discrimination numbers we've seen. And so what we see is a plan in place is helpful to get started. If you wait till that person walks in the door, then it becomes a tailored plan for this person at this particular site. So do take a look at these guidelines and we can also help with that. Because the workplace guidelines talk about some basic things, that employees deserve a right to privacy, that any information about them transitioning is based on HIPAA and is confidential in the workplace. And that there has to be a transition plan. How is this going to work? How is the employee going to be introduced back into the team? What kind of training is going to happen? How do you do the name changes and the pronouns so all employees are there? And again, as I mentioned, my friend that I've known for many years, there's still times when I'll use the wrong pronoun for him, even though he's transitioned for 25 years now, because we knew each other. We have life experience. That's not the problem. A misstep or a mental lapse for a moment is not a problem. What you have to watch for is those people who say, I will not do this, I cannot do this, it's not okay, I refuse to change, and recognize this person is who they are. So make sure that you've reviewed all those guidelines and had those discussions. Some of the considerations, again, that coming out in job risk. If someone comes up to you in the workplace and says, I'm thinking about transitioning, what should I do? It means they trust you, and we'll talk a lot in Section 3 about being an ally. But also, this part in terms of the business plan is talking about how do you do this confidential transition plan and establishing a transition team so that everyone's informed and can advocate for the employee, and thinking about things like facilities, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well, and allowing time to develop a framework that everyone can agree to. And it's important to be flexible. I've had a couple of situations where employees were in their process of coming out, came out to their family, and turned out had a family member who wasn't comfortable, and that created a lot of personal havoc in their lives in terms of how that was happening, and it needed to kind of slow down the timeline, wasn't ready to transition in the workplace as quickly as they thought they would be able to. So it is still people going through a process that everyone's learning at the same time and supporting them. And just like we do, with any other major, medical aspects of someone's life, we're going to be there to support them in the workplace and understand the situations and change and adapt when we need to. And again, for management, HR, and D&I, the important part is being that the process of transitioning is happening and that it's a privacy issue. Just a reminder there. One area that always comes up around discussion, and we've seen some federal cases or some election cases that have happened around the country, is the restroom use. And basically advising HR and management that they're obliged to provide transgender employees with the same level of facilities. And there's some new guidelines that from OSHA that say once a person identifies in their new gender as a male or a female, they use the restroom of their choice. And we have a lot of discussions about that because people say, well, how do I do this? And many facilities retrofit and do a single-use restroom. Now, that's not for the transgender employee, but if there's an employee who's uncomfortable, it says, there's a man in the restroom and I'm not comfortable with that, we have a single-use restroom that we can provide for you to feel comfortable with that. Using, if you think about, for example, McDonald's has retrofitted their restrooms for the most part that all the restrooms are floor to ceiling and there's a locking door. So there's things that you can do, dressing areas, gowning areas, and all of that. It takes some discussion and people get concerned about that. But in fact, for someone who is transgender, there has been no situation where someone who's transgender has gone into a restroom facility and perpetrated any kind of violence or harassment. There are already laws in place that if someone said, hey, I'm a guy and I want to go in the women's restroom, and so I'm going to cross-dress and I'm going to look like a woman and I'm going to go in there and I'm going to harass women, there are laws against that already. We don't have to change anything. We don't have to add anything. That's already in place. And this is the OSHA guidelines, so another reference for you here was released June 1st and talks about, once someone identifies, they can use the restrooms that correspond to their gender identity. And companies have created written guidance on this to make sure employees understand that. And OSHA is a great source for that because, again, it's not something that would be nice to have. It is now mandated, and you can be fined and if you don't comply with that. So what we know so far is we've got a better understanding of gender identity. It's estimated in the United States that about 700,000 adults identify as transgender. It is that internal sense that of self that is different from your assigned or birth sex, but remember that we all have a gender identity. And for some, transition is through a medical procedure, but it's not required. There's potential health and work impact if there's no access for the employee to transition in terms of their own stress, but also their performance in the workplace. And there's lots of model programs that can be used, and the guidelines are helpful with that. So longer section talking about gender identity, but just know that the transitioning employee has a right to be who they are and expressing their gender identity without fear or consequences in the workplace from their team or from their job or their promotability. And the company needs to recognize the rights of those employees, that they want to continue working for the company and doing great work. We had one situation early in talking about gender identity where a man went to medical school, was a surgeon, transitioned, and the medical board said you can no longer be a surgeon because you, in your new female name, never went to medical school. Had to fight that. The medical board finally relented on that, and she's now a very well-known surgeon in that. So that's kind of what we've got there. Any questions have come in, Daniel, that we need to jump in before we go to the next section?
Yeah, we had a more of a comment from John talking about the process of coming out over and over again, particularly around transitioning and what that looks like in terms of safety and the importance of educating management and leadership.
Right, and I see Jack had a question about the law regarding harassment in the restroom. It's usually a city or a county ordinance in the area where you are. I don't think there's a federal law, but we can take a look at that. And Nancy asked a question about, are you finding that these numbers are getting larger in the generations coming up? In terms of, I think there's more visibility, just like there's gay straight alliances in the school, so we see more LGBT individuals coming out, having the discussion, being allies. I think, okay, great. All right, well, let's go ahead and go into gender expression, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. I'll just take a moment because I know we are at the top of the hour. This is a 75-minute presentation, so if anyone does need to hop off to join other meetings or whatnot, this will be recorded. It will be sent out as a post email to everyone on the call, and then will also be available on the Out and Equal webpage, so thank you for that question. Let's now go ahead and go into gender expression. So how we outwardly express our gender in the confines of the social norms of what we understand to be masculine or feminine. And some different phrases for gender expression, again, feminine, masculine, cross-dressing, androgyny, nonconforming, and then we talk about drag queen or drag king. And this is really more of a performance expression. But let's spend some time talking about masculine and feminine. Again, recognizing that these are what society has taught us is masculine and feminine. Okay? And this can manifest itself in our dress, in our speech, and in our mannerisms. And important to recognize that no one of us would necessarily define as fully masculine or fully feminine. So if we begin looking at the feminine spectrum, what we might define as very, very feminine would be pretty Princess Barbie. Okay? And if we look on the other end of the feminine spectrum, we could define that as Rosie the Riveter. Okay? And again, recognizing that any individual might fall someplace differently along that pipeline if we looked at it from a 1 to 10 scale. Again, thinking about masculine, if we define very, very masculine as G.I. Joe on one end of the spectrum, and the other end of masculine as Boy George, again recognizing that different individuals might fall different places on the spectrum. I'll default myself to Malibu Ken on a good day. So we talk about masculine, feminine. And the other two phrases that we see are non-conforming, so individuals who might embrace aspects of both what we associate as masculine and feminine, and then also androgyny, okay, so not necessarily associating with those social norms of masculine and feminine, and different places along the spectrum with that. Some different expressions that we see in media, again, noting that this goes across age, race, and socioeconomic backgrounds, and also recognizing that gender expression can vary based on region. So what might be what we would associate as very masculine expression in the United States might look differently as we go across the globe. Okay, and then also recognizing that when we meet an individual, part of our gender expression leads into unconscious bias, and that is part of our reptilian brain. There's a small portion in the back of our brain called the amygdala, and this was responsible for how we've evolved as a species. It's our fear, fight, or flight center. Okay, so in primitive times, if we would see a predator or a person who might be of harm, we would need to make a judgment call right away about whether or not we would need to run away to save our life, or whether or not this might be a food source. Again, part of how we've survived as a species, but part of it is because our brain wants to put things into neat little boxes. It's how we digest information. Okay? Part of the unconscious bias piece is that our unconscious mind can make about 1 million determinations within 1 second. Our conscious mind is much further behind, only making about 20 to 40 pieces of information per second. Okay, so it's doing a lot of that work for us. Again, it's part of how we survived, putting things into neat little boxes. Okay, but it's trying to break down those myths and stereotypes around gender expression and using the conscious mind to overcome the unconscious mind to make those assessments for yourselves. Okay, let's spend some time talking about myths and stereotypes. So we're defining a myth as a false belief or set of ideas or stories surrounding a particular phenomenon or group. And then a stereotype is a simplified or standardized conception or image with a specific meaning held in common by people of another group. Okay, and again, myths and stereotypes are how we put information together. Let's think about different myths and stereotypes as they relate to the LGBT community. And again, we're going to ask for your active participation here. So using the chat box in the left-hand corner, go ahead and type in some different myths and stereotypes that might be associated with gay men. So if I was casting a very stereotypical gay man in a television show, what would be some of the attributes that I would attribute? Okay, effeminate. Again, these don't necessarily have to be how you feel personally, but what are some different things that you might see reflected in media? Can't play sports, flamboyant, weak. Okay, we see flamboyant again. Good, all adjectives well-dressed that we would associate stereotypically with a gay man. Promiscuous, hairdresser, girl. Okay, good. You know, and some of these things could be held true, but not necessarily for all people across all spectrums. High-pitched voice, good taste, bossy. And you know, some of these are also compliments as well, right? So let's go ahead now and talk about lesbians. What are some different myths and stereotypes that you might see reflected for lesbians within the community? Okay, whether that's through social, great. Butch, looks like a guy, again butch, wants to be a man. Aggressive, boyish, man-hating, unattractive. UPS driver, aggressive, short hair again. Okay, sometimes we see a PE teacher, which I know Pat was a PE teacher at one point, so she lives up to that stereotype there. Great, thank you. Talk about the bisexual community. What might be some myths and stereotypes with regard to the bisexual community? Confused, greedy, Promiscuous, confused. Great. And we spent some time earlier in the session talking about different myths and stereotypes. Indecisive, uncommitted, afraid to admit that they're lesbian or gay. Great. Now how about the transgender community? What might be some myths and stereotypes for transgender individuals? Confused. Okay. Confusing for others. Weirdo. Okay. Sexual orientation changes, psychologically damaged, mentally ill. Now let's throw this next one out there. Let's turn the coin around. Say, what are some different myths and stereotypes for corporate employees, recognizing that we have a lot of business and corporate individuals on the phone with us? White male, rigid, bottom line driven, aggressive, minions, greedy, robots. And part of the reason that we do this is just to recognize that there are myths and stereotypes associated with many different groups and cultures. It's part of how we digest information in our brain, but it's using our conscious mind to battle the unconscious bias that we might have within ourselves. So thank you all for your participation with that. Spend some time talking about heterosexism. Now that's a mouthful of a word. And we define heterosexism as attitudes or bias and perhaps discrimination in favor of opposite sex sexuality or relationships. So it's the assumption that if you meet an individual that they have a partner or attraction to somebody who is of the opposite gender. Okay, so if I was in a workplace scenario, I might ask someone if they have a husband or a wife based on their gender, assuming that they are in fact attracted or partnered with somebody of the opposite gender. Again, thinking that you can spot somebody who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, or thinking that all parents are in fact heterosexual. Okay? And part of this might not be the discrimination or hatred part of it, but it's just not having that outward awareness that somebody's circumstances could be outside of your own cultural background. But now let's spend some time talking about phobias: homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. And this can manifest itself in different ways. And this is really when we talk about the fear or hatred of the LGBT community. And some of this could be more submissive. So if I was a manager, I might look unfavorably on my LGBT employees and not necessarily put them up for the raise or give them the positive review that I could. But some of it could also come out in terms of slurs and jokes. And some of that could manifest in hatred and violence. Let's go ahead and take a quiz now. So what is the sexual orientation of someone who is transgender? Okay, and go ahead and put in your answer here and hit submit. What is the sexual orientation of someone who is transgender? Okay, got about 25% of you who have responded. And so the answer with this is any of the above. We want to make a clear line between sexual orientation, who we are attracted to physically, emotionally, romantically, and our gender identity, our deep internal sense of gender. And one more quiz. When you first meet someone and expect them to have an opposite sex partner, so this is the one that we just did, when you first meet someone and expect them to have an opposite sex partner, what would we define that as? And go ahead and hit submit there. Okay, and again, so this is heterosexist. So it's the assumption that someone might have an opposite sex partner or attraction. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Pat.
Excellent. And we've covered a lot of information today. But talking about how to break down that heterosexism, which is kind of an unconscious bias that we ask, that we can work on and be aware of, is doing things like asking, is there somebody important in your life? Do you have a partner? Would you like to bring someone to the event rather than would you like to bring your husband or wife? That's very different from the phobias, which are more actively, more aggressive, and usually should be handled by HR. And again, we'll talk about that more in the business case. Make sure you check out the pronouns. It's becoming more and more common for introductions to happen in a meeting. Your name, your office you work in, and what's your preferred pronouns. It starts the discussion about he or she or they and get people aware to start thinking beyond that binary that we usually operate in. And LGBT is, again, the recommendation when talking with employees in the workplace about the areas of that. But again, individuals can self-identify for themselves. And remember to think about employees that you work with. If you know they're LGBT, find out more about them. They have hobbies and lives and skills and abilities, and that's what we need to grow as a team. LGBT is just one of those dimensions of diversity that we see. So asking LGBT employees to speak on other topics, tell me how you got that project done so easily and with no errors, share with me that information. And never inquire of someone who's LGBT about their medical or personal issues on the job. I mean, if you're sharing and saying, I had a really bad fight with my partner or things like that, well, we shouldn't initiate that conversation. And, are you with anybody? Are you married? Are you the wife? Are you the husband? Those kind of questions are kind of invasive. And let each employee come out and tell their own story. Don't out them. Don't go up and say, hey, I can tell by the way that you act and your mannerisms that you're gay. I'm a safe ally. You can come out to me. Because for some people, that's just really uncomfortable. And there's things that you can talk about and be visible, and we'll talk about in the ally section about how to support and let employees know. But it is about them. And if you feel uncomfortable, if there's areas that we've talked about today that you went, wow, I just don't get that, I don't understand it, ask yourself why, and maybe that's an area for some additional study. So what we know at this point is that everyone's been assigned a birth sex or gender identity, sexual orientation and gender expression. Using LGBT, it's okay to ask for pronouns. Ask questions that are inclusive to get to know employees. And if you're uncomfortable, sort that out and ask yourself why, and maybe talk with someone else. So I think we've gotten most of the questions answered. I'm going to check. We've got one more. Yvette made a comment about bisexuals have a very negative stereotype, and do we see that changing? I think so. We see the bisexual population in the workplace being the most in the closet. If you look at LG and T, bisexuals are the ones who don't want to come out and don't want to be visible. And I think there's work and discussions that happen. There is some work going on about a bisexual index that also helps to rate workplaces on how they're doing on that. So I think we'll continue to have that discussion as more people come out. Again, that'll be a more comfortable conversation. Did you see any other questions, Daniel, on that?
No other questions at this time.
All right. So we're right at the end here. Thank you for staying with us. Part 2 and 3 of the classes will be on March 8th and 15th. You do need to register, and this is a fee-for-service for the additional webinars. You can go up on the university page for online training, click on the Building Bridges Live registration link. And remember, if you want to train the trainer certification, we can send you some more information on that. We will send you a follow-up email with the handouts, which will be the slide deck and the terminology sheet. And if you are registered for Part 2 and 3, you'll receive the podcast recording link as well. There'll be an evaluation. Thanks very much for joining us, and we hope to see you in the coming weeks. And thank you for all the work that you're doing about LGBT workplace equality.